Grace and peace to you from our Lord Jesus Christ and God our Father. We're in Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 to 22, which is the end of the narrative of the book that is called Ruth. It's called Ruth, presumably, because she is a primary agent in the story. She is the one who is active in the story, doing things in the story, along with Boaz. Ruth is the one through whom the genealogy of David comes. But actually, as we'll see tonight, it's really a story about Naomi. That Naomi is the more prominent one in the narrative. Ruth has a very important role to play, of course, along with Boaz. But both of them are agents. They have agency. They participate. They contribute. And nothing would have happened if they didn't participate, right? But the story is about Naomi. Listen for that as we read the final verses of Ruth. Ruth chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, and Amminadab of Nahshon, and Nahshon of Salmon, and Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. You notice Ruth doesn't get a word in edgewise, right? And she's not the object of the blessing. Naomi is the one who gets blessed. Right? And I think it's really important to notice, because if you remember, we go back to chapter 1, particularly verses 19 to 22. How is the tragedy of Naomi described there? Go back to chapter 1, verses 19 to 21. What are some of the words that are used to describe the tragic circumstance which Naomi finds herself in? What does Naomi say about God and about her situation?
Bitter.
Okay, she's bitter. In fact, that's the name she wants, right? She wants to be called Mara instead of Naomi, because Naomi means pleasant. And as she comes back to Bethlehem with no husband and no sons and a Moabite daughter-in-law who has no children, she is bitter. She's bitter toward God, bitter toward circumstances. Her life, well, she describes her life. How else does she describe it there? She's empty. It's kind of like you get to the end of your life and you say, I don't have anything to show for it. I have no legacy. I have no children. I have no family. I have no support. I'm empty. And my daughter-in-law is unmarried. She's a widow, and she doesn't have any children. So, okay. And how else does she describe this? Say that again, please. The Lord is against me. That's kind of the opposite of blessing me, right? The Lord is against me. She can't explain these circumstances. The famine that drove her family to Moab. In Moab, the daughter-in-laws don't have any children. The husband dies. The two sons die. It's that kind of Jobian feeling, right? That this is kind of the same circumstance Job found himself in some ways. Just feeling rejected by God. Yeah.
I too is really important that she did know God. I mean, she saw what he did to her, so she knew God was.
She knew God was what?
What?
Yeah. She knew God. She's calling Yahweh by name, right? Yahweh has done this to me. But she's not happy with Yahweh. I mean, what else does she say about Yahweh? I came back empty. He's against me. I'm bitter about this. Brought misfortune, brought evil upon me, brought trouble upon me. The Lord caused my misery, right? This is what the Lord did. She doesn't have any other way to perceive it. The Lord wasn't absent. The Lord wasn't apathetic. The Lord did this. I mean, this is how she's internalizing it and lamenting, feeling that hurt, feeling those wounds. Remember we talked about that, 5-6 weeks ago at least, how this story about Naomi's hurt and pain is the story not of a faithless woman, as Bobby's pointing out. It's not that she lacks faith. It's that she doesn't understand, doesn't kind of perceive any rationale for her circumstance, given that Yahweh is her God. Why hasn't Yahweh loved on me and blessed me? Instead, I got this. Right? And we might all feel that kind of natural affinity for those sorts of feelings. Right? They fill the Psalms. They fill the book of Job. It's in Ecclesiastes. It's in Lamentations. It's in Jeremiah. It's Moses even says some stuff like that, right? In his frustrations. So it's not unusual. Even Jesus on the cross quotes a lament, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? Anything else you want to say about chapter 1, verses 19 to 22? Any other language there? I think that gets the gist of it, but there might be something else you see. All right, when we come over to chapter 4, and we begin at verse 13 through verse 17, not counting the genealogy at the moment. This is a big difference, isn't it? This is reversal. And in fact, as we have looked at in the narrative, Boaz marries Ruth, and they notice the language of conception here, the language of getting pregnant. The Lord did it. Oh, wow, that's so okay. The Lord gives a child. So as much as she ascribed to the Lord the agency of her misery, now, by the way, who's saying this and who's saying this blessing? Well, we haven't got to the blessing yet, but the narrator, I misspoke there. We haven't got to the blessing yet. But in terms of the narrator, The narrator is linking us to Naomi's speech in the first chapter. So this is the narrator's claim that the Lord gives. And this is the first time the narrator has actually said the Lord did something. Now, it's been in the dialogue, Naomi say the Lord did this or that, but the narrator says, no, okay, this is the Lord's response to what Ruth and Boaz have agreed to. Right? And she bore a son. Now, let's look at the blessing. Who is offering the blessing? It's who? The women. All right, that's kind of strange. You remember the story of John the Baptist being born? And they said, what are we going to name him? Who got the name? Who actually named John the Baptist? Or just John? He wasn't the Baptist till later, right? No, so it was Zacharias, wasn't it? Yeah. The father name. Now that was typically the father names, right? Remember, we got a patriarchal society where inheritance is through the males, and all of that comes into play. So it's just a social custom that the father names. But that's not what's happening here. Right? In fact, the women are going to name in just a moment. But it's the women who are offering the blessing, not the men, but the women. Now, what do you see in the blessings? What are the women blessing this child? What are they saying about this child? I'm sorry? Okay, well, yeah, you see in that verse 14, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin or guardian redeemer or kinsman redeemer. That's probably talking about Boaz there, right? Because Boaz is the kinsman redeemer. But notice it's the Lord who gets credit for that. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you. The Lord, and the blessing is actually saying the Lord has kind of orchestrated this in some way. That God is going to get the credit, going to get the blessing. We're going to ascribe to God what belongs to God. And God is the one who has orchestrated this so that Naomi was not left without a kinsman redeemer. Because you could be left without a kinsman redeemer. Let's say there was only one son in the immediate family and that son dies. There's not going to be any kinsman redeemers among the siblings, let's put it that way. Now, get to the extended family, but potentially you might not have a kinsman redeemer, right? You may not have someone who can do what the role Boaz has come to play. Yeah.
Why do you think it said may become famous throughout Israel? Talking about the redeemer.
Yeah, now this is a tricky question here.
About the baby.
Yeah, that's kind of the question, and people disagree about this. So if you look at verse 14 carefully, he says, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin or kinsman redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. To whom does the his refer? Who is the his? Is it the kinsman redeemer? Boaz is now going to have a name. Well, Boaz has already had a name, right? But if you look at the next sentence, he shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your own age, of your old age. Now, it still could be the kinsman redeemer because the redeemer is going to take care of Naomi, right? So the he could still be Boaz. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Now, she didn't bear Boaz, right? Has borne him, which seems to me, and again, people disagree about this, but it seems to me that his name and that he who's going to restore Naomi's life and be her caregiver in her old age is the one whom Ruth bore. So we're talking about Obed here, that Obed is going to have a renowned name in Israel. Now, Obed didn't get a renowned name, really, right? Not at least according, not in the traditions of the Hebrew Bible that we have. But it's probably referring not just to Obed, but to the lineage itself. And that maybe the name here is David. That's the last name we get, David. It's like we get to the genealogy of David and, oh, enough said. Yeah. So I think probably that we're looking ahead, that this lineage that is going to continue here with Obed and go to Jesse and then to David, that lineage is going to be a renowned lineage. It's going to be a lineage that Naomi finds rest in. She finds care in. She is not without support. She's not without family. She's not without resources. And it is the fruit of the one who loves Naomi. Now, notice that language there in verse 15. For your daughter-in-law. We're talking to Naomi here. We're not talking to Ruth. You know, just imagine a situation where your daughter-in-law gives birth and you as the mother-in-law get all the attention. That doesn't fit our culture, does it? In fact, that might be kind of the fruit of, that might bring some conflict if that's how it got, right? Where the mother-in-law gets all the attention. But here, Naomi is the one who's being addressed, right? And she's being blessed along with the Lord. The daughter-in-law who loves you, Naomi. So the child is, remember, this is a kinsman redeemer, a goel, kinsman redeemer. We're buying something back. We're regaining something. We're restoring something. We're renewing something. And what the daughter-in-law who loves you does is restores Naomi's life. And the one that she bears is also a restorer. Right? Not only the kinsman redeemer, but the son is a restorer. Ultimately in David. Now, you know, as we read this with Christian eyes, we can see some messianic kind of overtones there, that this child has been born. Now, we're in the Christmas season here. So when we think about a child who has been born, whether we're thinking about Isaiah 9, or we're thinking about Samuel, or we're thinking about Isaac, or we're thinking about Jacob and Esau. Here we're thinking about Obed, who will be the grandfather of David. A child is born. And that son represents, in that culture, that son represents life and heritage and future and hope. And you can imagine that, right? You can imagine in that kind of patriarchal culture the meaning of a son. To carry on the inheritance. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the end of Job, when Job and God come to terms, you know, in chapter 42, verse 6, when Job has children again, and he has 7 sons and 3 daughters, you notice what Job does with the daughters? He gives them an inheritance like the sons. In other words, he equalizes the inheritance, which is a symbol of renewal, a symbol of value, valuing the daughters as well as the sons. And we have something of that well, here it's focused on the son. So notice, when you get that, you have those blessings. He's a restorer of life, a nourisher of life, a renowned name, a nourisher, caregiver. This is the blessedness of Naomi. And the contrast here is the bookends of the narrative. We begin with tragedy, the tragedy of Naomi. Not so much tragedy of Ruth, although she has her own tragedy, but the focus is on the tragedy of Naomi. And then we have now the blessedness of Naomi. And look what happens in verse 16. Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her bosom, and became his nurse. That kind of shocking to the 21st century? That the mother-in-law becomes the nurse of the child? I mean, we can get some good television shows out of that one. I imagine, if we tell that storyline, a dominating mother-in-law. Mother-in-laws always get the conflict stories in literature, and I just think Cinderella, right? I mean, that's a stepmother, though. Yeah. Huh?
You are being recorded.
They what?
You are being recorded.
Yes, I am. I'm sorry. No, but seriously, that's just a way of underscoring this is about Naomi. She takes the child and she's going to nurse the child. This is her heritage. This is her life. This is her future. And she's going to love that child and receive that child as a gift. And that's the nature of the blessedness. Blessed be Yahweh, because Yahweh did all this. Yahweh has done this for you. Ruth has that agency in it. Ruth loves you. Your daughter-in-law Ruth loves you. And Boaz is present as a kinsman redeemer. They had their role. They played their part. They were the worthy characters who showed chesed to each other and to Naomi. Showed loving kindness, chesed, to them. So they're important characters, and they're agents in the story, but it's a story about Naomi. And how God, as Naomi put it, God did this to me, and now God has renewed my life with this child. The coming of a child is the renewal of life. So that I think the bookends are really important to stress. So even the women of the neighborhood, it says, verse 17, gave him a name. They named him. Now that's really strange. They named him. A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed, which means worker. I don't know. Maybe they think Obed would be, we're going to name him Obed so he works hard. I don't know. Yeah. Or maybe Obed because this is the one who will inherit the heritage of Naomi and her husband. Now, one of the things I'd like us to think about for just a moment is what is this narrative? Why is this narrative in the Bible? Yeah.
You always get on me about reading that other short book that I love so much. I think this book here, I've enjoyed reading it probably as much as I had back.
Oh, okay.
Because the genealogy of Jesus always, you know, had me thinking about how could God use people like Ahab. And I think this shows me that God is in charge.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a narrative of God's hidden footprints, right? That God is actually at work in hidden ways, even when God is not named, and God is only named doing something with, by the narrator in the section that we're reading now. So yeah, I think there's a theology of providence, that life can go bad and life can be blessed, but either way, blessed be the name of Yahweh, right? Even though when things go bad, we can be bitter about it and we can struggle with it and lament it. Yeah. So providence is a key idea here for sure.
What's your question again?
What would be, why is it here? What is it what does this narrative give us?
It gives us the beginning of the story.
Okay. Beginning of what story?
Messianic king.
Oh, okay. So it's about, yeah, go ahead.
To back up just a minute, when they say, who is better to you than 7 sons? And David is the youngest of Jesse's 7 sons.
Mm-hmm.
And David is the Messianic king that comes from Obed. And that's leading us to the story of all the way down to Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's the beginning of the New Testament or Second Testament already.
Yeah.
Of David. Is that making sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think
I mean, it's like the beginning of the Christian story.
the beginning of the story of David. Within the story of Abraham, this is the beginning of the story of David, which is then the beginning of the story of the Messianic child who is promised, right? So yeah, I think there's that continuity here. And the genealogy helps us see that, right? Because the genealogy starts with Perez. In fact, the way verse 18 begins, these are the generations of, literally what it says, these are the generations of, which is exactly how Genesis introduces genealogies. These are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Abraham, or, etc. These are the generations of Perez. And we go from Perez to Hezron, to Ram, etc. Now, so I think the genealogy might give us a hint as to why we have this narrative. The legitimization of David. He has a genealogy. He has a heritage. He has a connection with the patriarchs. Perez is the son of Judah, who is the son of Jacob, who is the son of Isaac, who is the son of Abraham. So there's that kind of legitimizing. Some even guess, and it would only be a guess, that some were questioning whether David should be king or not. Maybe they were questioning his genealogy. And so this narrative says, hey, this is where David came from. Yeah, maybe not. But genealogies are important, not because somebody is delegitimizing it, but they're important because they are legitimizing it. All right? It's a part of the culture to have that genealogical connection. So yeah, the story of David. So we're being introduced into the story. We're getting the background of the story of David, which is filled with noble characters and chesed and the blessing of Yahweh. Right? Yeah, I think that works as well. Some suggest Ruth is here because in the post-exilic period, under Ezra, those who were married to non-Israelites were required to divorce them and marry Israelites. And some think Ruth is written to say, no, that's just the wrong way to go with that. The story of Ruth tells us, hey, this can work. I think those are two really different situations. Like in Ezra, the wives, the marriages, I should say, the marriages are complicit in idolatry. In other words, this is not a marriage devoted to Yahweh. Whereas for Ruth, Ruth says, your God will be my God. She's committed to Yahweh. She's committed to Israel, to the story of Israel. And so there's really two very different situations. I don't think they're parallel. But I think there's another dimension to Ruth I think is really important. And that is the way women are treated. And I've pointed this out a couple of times along the way. Remember at the end of Judges, we have a couple of stories of the violent murder of women. And the abuse of women in allowing Benjamites to kind of choose women for their wives. Because the Benjamites are low due to their own violence, right? I mean, it's a complicated story. We don't want to tell it all right here. But it's a very violent, anti-female trajectory at the end of the book of Judges. That happens right between the two statements that everybody did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king. And when everybody does what is right in their own eyes, and the guardrails are removed, women get the brunt of that. They're the ones who are abused, they're the ones who are misused, and they're the ones who suffer most in a patriarchal culture, particularly. So Ruth, especially the way our English canon puts it, you know, the Protestant canon. In the Hebrew Bible, Ruth is back there with Chronicles and the writings. But here it comes right after Judges. But the book of Ruth begins with, in the days of the judges. So we know where it's located. It's located in a world that was hostile to women, at least toward the end of the Judges, particularly. At the beginning of Judges, we have Deborah, who is a leader in Israel, a judge, a prophet. So it's not the same situation as at the end of Judges. But at the end of Judges, you have this very negative story about the treatment of women. What you get in Ruth is the opposite. You get a Boaz who shows chesed to Ruth, who honors the kinsman redeemer. And in the 4th chapter, steps into the background. The only thing about Boaz here in chapter 4, verses 13, in the ending of Ruth, the only thing about Boaz is he went in and made a baby. That's all there is said, but okay, he made a baby. The rest of it's about Naomi and about Ruth bearing a child and about Ruth being the loving daughter-in-law. Not anything else, except Boaz is just the father. Yeah.
It's on what you said a while ago. You know, Naomi and Ruth was in a place that hated the Jews too. The Moabites didn't like Jews at all. But yet God took that situation and worked it all out.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not only about women, it's about a woman who was living at the very margins of society. If we think about stereotypes and the difficulties that some, women have less power than men in cultures. In our culture, women of color have less power than white women. And when you think about this culture coming into Bethlehem, you have a Moabite who is apparently barren, who has no children, a Moabite who has no children and has no husband. She is on the margin of society. She's the one that people could forget about.
But God blesses her just like
Yeah, but God blesses her, right? God is working with her. God is including her. And Boaz represents that chesed of God toward Ruth. So what we have is this opposite picture of the end of Judges. And I wonder if Ruth, the story of Ruth is told not only for the sake of David, but it's also told as a counter narrative to the violence toward women in Judges. That this is how men should treat women. How Boaz treated Ruth. This is the sort of chesed that should be in the community. And remember, Ruth has chesed as well, right? Ruth is a model of chesed to Naomi, just as Boaz is gives chesed to Ruth. So it's mutual, it's reciprocal, it's in relationship. It's not violent, it's nurturing. It's not destructive, it's empowering. And that's, I think that's part of the story of Ruth as well. So I think it has this David motif because of the genealogy at the end, but it also has this honoring of women in contrast to the violence that was so much a part of ancient Eastern culture toward women. I mean, women were property, women had no rights, they couldn't inherit, women could not execute divorces, only men could do that. You know, I mean, women were not, in the ancient Near East, certainly weren't independent. They didn't have rights. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, women do get some rights, which we could talk about another time. But I think the primary contrast is between the violence toward women at the end of Judges and the way women are valued in Ruth. Another way of coming at that, Perez, who's the mother of Perez? Anybody remember? Tamar. And remember, he comes from an incestuous relationship, at least daughter-in-law, father-in-law, right? And Tamar took initiative. And she preserved the lineage of Judah, but in a sexual scandal. Right? You might not know who the mother of Salmon is. The mother of Salmon. Now remember, genealogies are not always father-son. It could be like Perez and a grandson. You know, it's not strictly father-son. It can skip generations in terms of the genealogical naming. We see that in Matthew 1, where Matthew uses the genealogy and he skips some people. Probably has a reason for doing that. He wants to make it a symmetrical number of 14, 14, 14, you know, but that's perfectly acceptable practice to talk about grandsons or great-grandsons and not just sons. But we do know Rahab is the mother of Salmon. Oh, wait a minute, or is it the wife of Salmon? I don't remember. So, but Rahab figures in there somewhere. She's not named, but the story's known, I'm sure, right? So what we have is that somebody got an answer to that? whose mother was Rahab. Okay, so Salmon is the son of Rahab. Is that what we're saying? Okay, all right. I knew there was a connection, but I couldn't remember. Is that right? Whose mother was Rahab. Salmon's mother was Rahab. Okay, that's what it is. All right, yeah. So the Rahab story is kind of tucked in here too. Just like the Tamar story is kind of tucked in here. And so when we have now Ruth here as Moabitess, right? You can see how Matthew, when Matthew then tells the story of the genealogy of Jesus, he names 4 women, all of whom are non-Israelite. Tamar's a Canaanite. Rahab's a Canaanite, Jericho, right? Ruth is a Moabite. And Bathsheba is the wife of a Hittite. We're presuming that she is a Hittite as well. Maybe not, but I think it's a pretty good assumption. Can't prove it. Right? So, if that then factors into part of why this story is told. She's marginalized because she's a woman. She's marginalized because she has no children. She's marginalized because she's a widow. And she's also marginalized because she's an alien. So,
But God still loves her.
But God does not marginalize her. God uses her and is present in her life and in the life of Naomi to bring David into the story. And from David to bring the Messiah into the story. And so I think we ought to hear, as we come to the end of Ruth, I think we should hear the valuing of women in this story, the valuing of the alien, the non-Israelite in this story, and the valuing of life in the birth of a child who ultimately will be Emmanuel, right? God among us, or God with us. Yeah.
Can you say more about the neighbor women
The neighbor women?
and culture at the time?
In terms of, you mean, okay, so remember she comes into Bethlehem and the women say, oh, that's Naomi. You know, there's kind of,
It could be relatives of her.
it could include relatives. I mean, she has relatives. The kinsman redeemer is a relative, right? So yeah, it could be. But it's also just village women, I think, who know Naomi's desperate circumstances and now are rejoicing with her and engaged in the very blessing and naming of the child, right? Which is a symbol of their care for Naomi, that they were willing to do that.
They did that with Elizabeth too.
Yeah, well, they gathered around Elizabeth, said, well, we're going to call the child, right? And then Zacharias says, no, we're going to call him John. Yeah. I mean, that's going on there too. So it's a more communal feel. In the ancient culture, we just don't have that today. We have our babies in hospitals, and we're kind of cordoned off from people. It's not a communal event, right? There's not a communal, I mean, we throw showers and we may recognize a child or something, you know, but there's no sense of communal participation. Oh, this is our child too. You know, this is part of our community. Yeah, these midwives, you know, what would be essentially midwives. Yeah. There weren't doctors like we have today, for sure. You know, there were different kinds of doctors, but midwives were the ones who would give birth, would help with the baby. So I think, one of the things that we do here at Woodmont, right, is we name the children once a year, right, who have been given to us, to the community. We honor the mother and father or whoever is involved, whether it's adoption or whether it's single parent. We honor that person, and we honor the child, and we name the child, and we say the child is part of this community. And we share responsibility in that way. And that's an ancient culture. That would be Bethlehem. That they see this child not just as Naomi's child or as Ruth's child, but it's our child. And we have responsibility toward the child. And we rejoice and we bless and we thank God for this child. And we see the renown that comes through that child, the name that he will bear.
One of the great things to me is it's all taking place in Bethlehem.
In Bethlehem, yeah, which is another connection, isn't it?
There is.
Yeah, another connection. Well, thank you for walking with me through the book of Ruth. I've enjoyed it. 8 lessons, and this is the final one. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.
Thank you, John Mark.